I have been working on oil and oil issues for a very long time. My background includes working for 2 United States members of Congress, and it was actually working for Congress and trying to work on domestic social policy that I kept running into the role and influence of corporations, making it more difficult to do the work that we wanted to do, and left Capitol Hill to basically focus on that impediment to public policy. And working on corporations, it didn't take very long to have my focus shift really almost very quickly and almost exclusively to the oil industry. Beginning in the year 2000 with the Bush administration was really the period of the rise of, I'm going to move over here, the rise of the wealth of the oil industry to proportions where it really hadn't been in a significant period of time. All right, we're going to get happy with this at some point. All right, good. And really just started catapulting during the 8 years of the Bush administration. And that was for a number of reasons, which we can talk about later, but basically the rise of the wealth of the industry to historic modern heights occurred over the 8 years of the Bush administration. And of course, we're down a little bit in 2009, but today we have new oil company profit reports just out, and they are back, if anyone was worried. The oil industry's profits are back to where they were in 2008, absolute record-breaking highs, and they now remain the wealthiest industry on the planet, so we can all feel rest assured that they're doing great. And when the Deepwater Horizon exploded on April 20th, 2010, 50 miles off the coast of Louisiana, I was contacted right away by people asking me to write about it, and I started writing about it. But a couple weeks afterwards, I went down to Houston for actually Chevron's annual shareholder meeting, where I was gathered with a number of people from Chevron-affected communities where Chevron operates around the world, who had gathered for Chevron's shareholder meeting. We were there, and then a number of the people who were part of our network were from the Gulf Coast, and they brought us down to the Gulf Coast afterwards to see for ourselves what was happening. And I realized on that first trip, which was at that point several weeks after the explosion had taken place, that this wasn't your average explosion and your average problem. Because anyone who knows about offshore oil, unfortunately, knows that deaths happen fairly regularly. Explosions happen, spills happen. Of course, the loss of 11 lives was unique and extreme. The loss of a rig was unique and extreme. But what became clear after several weeks, which we didn't know preceding the explosion, was that the oil industry actually had no idea how to deal with a deepwater blowout. And to explain what deepwater is very quickly, the vast majority of offshore drilling always has and still does take place at about 400 feet below the ocean surface. So you've got the ocean, and then 400 feet below that is where the drilling starts, typically, that or shallower. In the last 20 years or so, the industry has really, in a significant way, moved into the deeper water. And it used to be that actually the definition of deep water was a 400-foot well, 400 feet below the ocean surface. Now the definition of a deep water well is 5,000 feet below the ocean surface. So you take the rig, you then go down 5,000 feet to the ocean floor. This well is another 13,500 feet below that. So it's 18,500 feet below the ocean surface. And that's not even close to the deepest. Actually, for a while, the deepest was another BP well called the Tiber well out in the Gulf of Mexico. It was 40,000 feet down. So it was as far down as Mount Everest is up. And that's still not the deepest well. But this is fairly new production, fairly new operations. But the industry guaranteed us that as they moved further and further out, and as that really started happening within the last 10 years, that they knew what they were doing. That they could handle the worst case scenario. And everybody knew what the worst case scenario is, because every document that they had to file to say what they would do if it happened said that the worst case scenario is a blowout. And everyone knows you can have a blowout in the Gulf of Mexico because the Gulf of Mexico is one of the most difficult areas to drill in the world. What makes it so difficult is that it's really gaseous. There's a lot of natural gas and different and methane gas, and the gas makes it a much more difficult location to drill because the gas is lighter than the oil, and the gas rises up above the oil, and it creates bubbles and it kicks back, and it makes it very difficult to drill. And everyone knew that was the case in the Gulf of Mexico, and everyone knew that a blowout is what would be the worst case scenario. And what the oil industry guaranteed us was that, one, they could cap a blowout should it happen, but two, they could handle a spill if it happened. And what we knew within several weeks was that, one, they did not know how to cap the well, and that includes everybody. That's not just BP, that's Chevron, that's Shell, that's Exxon. They all sat around a table and they all said, oh gosh, gee, I know we said we knew what to do, but golly gosh darn, we don't. Oh well. And so they spent 3 long months trying to figure out, and they worked very hard, believe me, to try and figure it out. They wanted to cap the well. They spent 3 long months trying to figure out how to do it. They had also guaranteed us that they could handle an oil spill of 300,000 barrels a day. That's what was in BP's documents that gave it permission to drill. What we found out is that at its worst, this oil spill was 80,000 barrels a day, and that they had not prepared, nor did they have any idea what to do to deal with that. And what being prepared would have looked like was container ships to hold the oil, boom, skim, to protect the shore, skimmers to pick up the oil. They didn't have any of these underwater vehicles ready to repair the damage. They didn't have any of this ready. And moreover, even though after the 1989 Valdez disaster, and they were required to invest in technology, because what happened after the Valdez disaster was that only 14% of the oil was actually recovered. The rest stayed in the environment. Was that they were told that you have to do better. You have to figure out a way to do better. And they said, oh, yes, we know how to do better. They didn't. The exact same technology that was used with the Valdez was used again here. The exact same chemical toxin, Corexit, was applied. And what we learned was that they weren't prepared for the spill, they weren't prepared for the cleanup, they weren't prepared to protect the shore. And I started figuring all of this out fairly quickly on in the first visit. And the other thing I figured out in the first visit was, unfortunately, how difficult it was going to be to understand what happened. Because from the very beginning, I tried to go onto a beach, and there were police there that said I couldn't go onto the beach. And I tried to ask questions of people working on the beach, and I was told I couldn't talk to them. And I tried to take pictures, and I was told I couldn't take a photo. And that was disconcerting. And I said, wow, one, this is going to be bigger than we thought. And two, it's going to be much harder than we thought to try and really understand what has taken place and what the impacts of this disaster are. So I decided at that point that I couldn't just write articles, I needed to write another book, and started writing this book. And as I said, it's my 3rd book, but this is definitely the most difficult one I've had to write. My other books are very policy-based. As I think I said in the beginning, I've been talking a lot today, so I apologize if I said, did I say this now or did I say it on the radio? I forget. My background is in public policy, and my other books are very policy-oriented. And I started writing this book in the same way that I wrote the other books. And then I realized that wasn't the crux of what was happening here. The crux of what was happening here was people's lives. And it started with the lives of the 11 men who died and their families, and I started interviewing their families, and the fishers who couldn't fish, and the people who work in the wholesale seafood industry who couldn't do their jobs, and the environmentalists who cared for their beaches, and the oil workers who cared for their jobs and cared for the lives of the colleagues who they lost, and the policymakers in Washington, and the people who work in the tourist industry, and the Homa United Nation, a Native American tribe that lives right in the foot of Duloc, Louisiana, which is part of the Fingers of Louisiana, and those fingers look more like they are suffering from leprosy these days because they've been so eaten away by coastal erosion. And the Homa are terrified that the land that they live on, which has already been being slowly and progressively eaten away, will now, when the next hurricane comes in, be dosed in oil and chemical dispersant, and they'll be no longer able to call that place home. And people who work at, who had to provide the services and the assistance in the wake of the disaster. And once I spent time down in the Gulf, I realized that that is what this was a story about. And it's also a story about the environment, of course. And this is the largest oil spill in world history, with just one exception, and that we would be able to say it was the largest oil spill in world history, except for one other man did a worse job, and that's Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein intentionally, literally used oil as a weapon in 1991 to attack approaching U.S. soldiers and British soldiers with oil, literally opening up valves and tankers to flood oil as an impediment to their approach. Had he not done that, this would be hands down, without any comparison, the largest oil spill in world history. It's 210 million gallons of oil were released. There is no comparison anywhere. And that is an enormous, obviously, environmental and ecological disaster. The Gulf of Mexico is the 9th largest body of water in the world. It is beautiful. I had not spent nearly as much time down there as I spent in the wake of this disaster, traveling to Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, Texas. The beaches are glorious. The sky is beautiful. The environment is pristine. And you walk on these beautiful beaches, and I had this experience over and over and over again. I was overwhelmed by the beauty, and I would forget why I was there. I decided, I'm here to enjoy a beautiful Louisiana beach. And then I'd see something in the distance that looked like, to my eye, like a dark pool of water that was made dark by the sun, or bark spread out all along the beach. And I'd look closer and realize that that pool was oil on the beach and the bark was tar balls on the beach. And the first time I encountered the tar balls, and the tar balls are when the oil comes in and it's been weathered with the sand and washes up on the beach, and there were whole beaches that were just blanketed in tar balls. There is a quote, and I opened the book with this. I'm going to need to look at it. Let's see. So this is what I write. The first time I held BP's oil in my hands, I was standing on a beach on Dauphin Island, Alabama. The oil had mixed with sand on its long journey from deep below the seafloor to form thick, brown, gooey patties that covered the beach for as far as the eye could see. A warning immediately came to mind, uttered long ago by Carlos Andrés Perez, the oil minister and then president of Venezuela, and a father of the modern oil industry. Quote, "Oil is the devil's excrement." And that's what it looked like, and that's what it felt like, that literally the industry had treated the beaches and the ocean with that level of disrespect. And that the feeling of people was that I heard over and over and over again as I walked along these beautiful beaches and I spent time on the Gulf Coast, was that a region that had just recovered from Katrina, just recovered from Gustav and Ike and Rita and all of these storms, had just built their way back, was then crushed by this incoming oil and doused by it for month after month after month, and then doused by the chemical dispersant for month after month after month, and then had oil burned on the surface of the ocean for month after month after month. And that they couldn't somehow break free from this hell, but this hell was very different because it was created out of an industry. And let me read another quote, and this opens the first chapter. This is by Stephen Lane Stone, who is a transocean roustabout, and he survived the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon. This event was set in motion years ago by these companies needlessly rushing to make money faster while cutting corners to save money. When these companies put their savings over our safety, they gambled with our lives, they gambled with my life, they gambled with the lives of 11 of my crew members who will never see their families or loved ones again. Now, I just came from London where I attended BP's annual shareholder meeting. And I went there with 5 Gulf Coast residents who'd been impacted by the disaster and were there representing their communities. So Byron Encalade, who is the president of the Louisiana Oystermen's Association, Tracy Coons of the Louisiana Shrimpers Association, her husband Mike, both of them longtime fishers, Diane Wilson, a fourth-generation shrimper from Texas, and others. And they had proxies to attend the shareholder meeting, and my organization had actually purchased shares for me so that I could attend. And their point of coming was to say, one, BP has not lived up to its financial, its legal, its moral obligation in the Gulf, which I'll get into, but that the oil is still there. We still haven't been able to get back to work. There is oil on the bottom of the ocean. There is dispersant on the bottom of the ocean. What there isn't is the life that is supposed to be on the bottom of the ocean. What there isn't is the baby oysters and the baby shrimp that we need to live. And you, BP, you, the shareholders, you, the chairman, you, the CEO, need to make things right. And we got to London and we had tons of press. The media really wanted to hear what we had to say. We did interview after interview after interview. We did a press conference on the front steps of the shareholder meeting. So by the time we got up to the shareholder meeting, they were pretty clear about the message that the Gulf residents had to bring. And therefore, in response to that, BP denied their access to the meeting, denied their proxies. Not a single Gulf Coast resident was admitted into the shareholder meeting. Now, I did not know that they were not being admitted into the shareholder meeting because I was still dealing with reporters. I got behind. I got late to the meeting. I went up to give them my papers to get in, and they said, "Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, you can go in, but you're not allowed to speak during the period in which shareholders are given the opportunity to address the meeting." And I said, "Well, that's odd, given that I'm a shareholder." And they said, "Yeah, well, you're going to have to come in as a guest." And, I argued for a little bit, and they said, "Forget it. I need to go in." I went in. "I'll take your piece of paper that says I'm not allowed to talk." And if anyone who knows me or has seen me do anything before would know that that's a really odd precondition to put on me and think that I was going to follow it. But so I went in, and when I got in is when I discovered that none of the Gulf Coast residents had gotten in. And I knew that it was my responsibility to be there on their behalf. But I had also come with a statement that had been given to me by Keith Jones. Now, Keith Jones was one of the first people I interviewed for the book, and I have continued to stay very close to him until today, and through the length of writing the book. And Keith's son, Gordon, was 28 years old, and he is a mud engineer and worked for a contractor called M.I. Swaco. And Gordon, his wife Michelle, when he was on the Deepwater Horizon on April 20th, his wife Michelle was 1 week away from giving birth to his second son, Maxwell Gordon. His older son had just had his 2-year-old birthday, his second birthday. Gordon was really excited to get home, and he was going to go home for 7 weeks to be there for the birth. And he was a really generous guy, and he was working his shift, but the person who was set to relieve him, Leo Linder, was tired. And when he showed up, Gordon said, "Wow, Leo, you look beat, man. Why don't you just go back to bed? I'll stay. I'll work the shift." And so Leo went back to bed, and Gordon was working his shift. And when the gas came up through the well, one of the things that should have happened, that should have saved Gordon, was there should have been alarms that should have gone off in the rig automatically. There should have been these lights that showed. And when the gas got into the rig, let's pretend we're in the rig right now. What should have happened is that door should have closed. There should have been doors here that sealed us in so that even if there was an explosion in here and all of us died, everyone else would be safe. But what happened was there were no lights, there were no doors, there was no ceiling. The alarms had been inhibited. And the men, though, who were in the area where the problems were happening knew that they were in trouble, but they stayed. They stayed because they were fighting to save the rig and fighting to save the lives of the rest of the men on board. And when the explosion happened, Gordon was one of the first people to die. And he died with 11 of his crewmates. And he died definitely saving the lives of 115 other men and women who were able to survive. And one of the reasons why those men and women survived, by the way, is one woman, one young woman named Antonia Juhasz, who in the press, because of the oil industry, has been castigated, and she's a heroine of the day. Antonia Juhasz was up on the bridge. She's 22 years old. She was the only person who noticed that the alarms weren't going off, that the rooms weren't being shut in. And she was the one who pushed the button that turned the alarms on. She's also the one who pushed the button that sent the mayday to say to the rest of the world, we're in trouble. Well, the oil industry has blamed her for not turning on the alarms sooner, so as to get out of being in trouble for the fact that the alarms were inhibited. And so she is now receiving a brunt of attack by the industry when she should be a heroine. Now, Keith sent me to London with a statement. And what the statement said was, your greed killed my son. Your cost-cutting, your rolling of the die with the safety of this crew and losing lost my son his life. And I'm going to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And so I read that statement, as much of it as I could, while being heckled. I told the CEO and the chairman of the board that there was nothing that they had said thus far, and nothing in their annual report that said that they had learned their lesson or that they were going to be doing anything differently. And that's sort of the bottom line from the oil side of this story, was that what we have learned, and what I learned through the course of writing this book, and of course cover in the book in great depth, and by reading all of the investigations, of which there have been tons, the Presidential Commission on the Deepwater Horizon, the Coast Guard and Interior Department investigation, the Deepwater Horizon Study Group, there have been so many studies, is that the problems that led to this disaster are in no way limited or unique to BP, that they were systemic problems embedded within the oil industry as a whole, and that what you see as you see the disaster unfold is that there were also just ridiculous regulatory oversights and just an utter lack of regulation and an extreme hubris on the part of the industry to push themselves out further than they really knew how to go. And the extreme costs associated with that, of course, was Gordon's life, 10 other men's lives, but then all the lives and livelihoods. So the other story that unfolds from spending this time in the Gulf and reading these stories is that you cannot separate out the environmental impacts in the Gulf from the human impacts. So 210 million gallons of oil were spilled. 2 million gallons of chemical dispersant were then added to that. The effect on sea life and the sea, of course, is deeply interrelated with all those whose lives and livelihoods depend on the sea and the sea life. But people in the Gulf Coast are also wed to the coast. A statistic I actually learned recently and experienced down there every step of the way was that for generations, people within Louisiana and across the Gulf Coast move, at most 4 miles from the site of where their, 5th generation family arrived, and that people stay for generations, and that they are wed to their location, and they stay through hurricanes and coastal erosion and oil because they are tied to this location and tied to this place. And the place has been, fouled by oil and dispersant, but the people remain. And the impacts are in the seafood, and the impacts are in their livelihoods, but the impacts are also in their health, because the oil was burned on the ocean surface. It's in the seafood. Oil is a toxin, and the dispersant is a toxin, and the combined effect is a worse toxin. And they're starting to do blood tests that are identifying PHPs, which are a component of oil in people's blood. So they're literally carrying the disaster in their blood. And the message that they came to was one, these impacts are long and deep going. And one of the things that I said to BP was you had not adhered to your financial obligations, and that's because BP was required under the Oil Pollution Act to set up a claims process. But they made that process so difficult that it was so poorly run that then it was taken over by Kenneth Feinberg, an independent administrator. But it remained so poorly run that 1 year later, only a third of payments have even been paid, and only a fourth have even been processed. So people don't have income, and they don't have their livelihoods, and they're also subsistence fishers, and they don't have food to eat, and their health is suffering. But they're also, for the first time, because the oil and seafood are also intimately mixed in the Gulf. And one of the stories that I love that I was able to tell, and I can't show you, there's also pictures in the book, and one of my favorite pictures is of the king and queen of the Morgan City, Louisiana Shrimp and Petroleum Festival. And the Shrimp and Petroleum Festival shows you sort of the heart of the linkage between oil and seafood. And the king and queen have a crown, and that crown is a crystal, huge crystal thing. In green crystal is an oil derrick, and in pink crystal wrapped around it is a shrimp. And that's the Shrimp and Petroleum Festival. And these are two key industries in the Gulf, and they're deeply interwed, and people are split between the two. But one of the reasons for that is that people think of Louisiana, it used to be really like a petrostate, right? But it isn't anymore. And when you look at what petrostates are, so I work on international oil policy, right? Iraq is a petrostate. About 86 to 90% of Iraqi GDP comes from oil. Angola is a petrostate. 86% of the GDP comes from oil. In Louisiana, 8% of the GDP comes from oil. It is not a petrostate. But the wedding to the industry comes from the history, but it also comes from the political power and influence of this industry. And a huge transformation that I saw over the course of the year that I spent on this work was that when I first showed up, not a single environmentalist would even say anything negative about the oil industry. They were too concerned about what that might do to them. By the end, the workers in the oil industry who I was interviewing were saying, we don't want to work in this industry anymore. It's too dangerous. It's not worth it. It's just, if you could give us something else to do, we'll do it. So if you in the liberal states can get your representatives to help us get things like, we'll build the wind turbines, we'll build the solar panels, we will happily go do your green jobs. But we can't get that here. We need you to fight for it there. And that was a huge shift over the course of the year, because they were tired of the oil, they were tired of the disbursement, and they were tired of learning that it wasn't just their own experiences that showed them how unsafe this industry was, it was the findings of the investigations that showed them that it wasn't just them, it was the industry. And they were ready for something different. So where does that leave us today? And what do we take from this experience? First is, it is the 1 year anniversary. It is the critical moment to actually recapture public attention. And I write extensively about the process that led to the public turning away from this disaster when it was so gripped. And what the oil industry did to make that happen, and what the Obama administration did to make that happen. But it's the 1 year anniversary, and it's our opportunity. There was a tremendous push towards legislation to respond to this disaster, all of which died in the summer of last year. But nothing changed to make that happen in terms of the underlying issues or the need for policy change. The 1 year anniversary is a time that we recapture the public attention, and people, this is on the front page of the newspaper, and we can say we still need change. So the Obama administration has put in some regulatory fixes, but they are welcome, but incredibly limited. And the problem that the Obama administration found itself in was 1 week before the disaster occurred, President Obama had implemented President Bush's policy of lifting the moratorium on offshore drilling. And that had included the West Coast. I'm from California, right? So that had included the West Coast as well as the East Coast. Then he backtracked on the West Coast and just opened up the East Coast and parts of Alaska that had been closed. And he had just done that when the disaster happened. In response to the disaster, he put in place a very limited moratorium and then lifted that. And the first company to get the first new exploration lease was BP. So big change is needed. And the changes that are needed are, one, to make sure that the Gulf is restored, people's livelihoods and the ecosystems. And that's money, and that's holding the industry's foot to the fire to make sure the restoration happens. Number two, unless we can put in place fundamental, radical restructuring of our regulatory regime, we shouldn't be doing offshore drilling. And I have seen nothing to make me think that that regulatory capacity is going to come into play, so therefore we shouldn't be doing it. Now, where I'm going to leave you before we go into questions is just one quick sentence. Actually, first, before I do that, I'm going to pass around a sign-in sheet. This is my email listserv, so I capture you all here. But then I'm going to leave you with this. Okay, gas prices. Everyone likes to talk about gas prices. When I do radio programs, that's all anyone wants to talk to me about is gas prices. But that's not what we're talking about today. And how you can know that you can actually protect the lives and the ecosystems of the Gulf Coast and protect your own pocketbook is that today we are producing more oil in the United States than we were 1 year ago. We have what the oil industry refers to as a glut of oil in the United States. And what they are doing with that is exporting it out of the United States. We are producing more than we were a year ago, but what else is true now than wasn't true a year ago? Gas prices are higher. Oil prices are higher. So what is the logical conclusion to if we drill more? What will happen to gas prices? What should happen, the supply and demand fundamental. Supply is up, demand, well actually, demand is up, supply is down. Supply is up, demand is also a little bit up. But the supply and demand fundamentals are not being met. Drilling more will do nothing to ease your gas prices or the price of oil. That is about regulation, and regulation of a whole other set of issues that we can talk about later. But the good news is that you can leave here and advocate for a ban on offshore drilling and not have to worry that you will simultaneously be adding to your pocketbook. So I leave you with that thought. Thank you all very much for sitting and listening. You can applaud. I'm going to take questions, and I talked a lot longer than I was supposed to, even though Miles told me not to talk so long. I did it anyway. We're going to take questions, and then I'm going to sign books, so definitely make sure you buy your book here. Supporting Powells is supporting independent bookstore, a place where you can actually sit and gather and hear an author and look at each other and talk to each other. And it takes money to do that. And you buying books is how they're able to provide us this space. If you just buy a book on Amazon, we can't all sit around and look at each other and have a nice conversation. So buy your book here, and then you get the extra bonus that I will sign it. Ooh, so exciting. Okay, questions?
I went down to the Gulf with a group of Oregonians, and we saw a lot of interesting things. Some of the stuff that you said. One of the things that was really interesting, made a big impact on me, was the bird rehab facilities. And I haven't read your book yet, but I'm wondering if you have a perspective on that, or what your perspective is about. And for me, it was sort of a lot of money goes into those facilities. They get a lot of publicity. I'm just wondering if you have any conclusions or observations about that.
So the question was about the bird rehabilitation facilities. So in response to this disaster, the Obama administration and BP spent enormous amounts of money. There was an enormous amount of employees who both worked for the industry and worked for the administration that worked tirelessly, that did amazing work. All branches of the service were involved. A huge amount of money was spent. There was a lot of great work that was done. And one of that was an attempt to try and identify and recover wildlife species that were harmed. There were good results to that. but it was a very small piece of a much bigger problem. And one of the things that I tracked in the book, it's hard to answer this question briefly, so I'm sort of stumbling through it because it's a big question. One of the reasons why people got so mobilized after the Valdez were those pictures of oiled birds, right? And there were oiled birds when this started, brown pelicans. Very moving. I have the AP brown pelican photo in here. It's the quintessential image of this disaster. Those pictures went away. And we all thought, well, that must mean that the oil's gone away and the problem's gone away. That's not what happened. We, reporters, people trying to cover the story, were increasingly and more aggressively barred from going anywhere near boom or beaches. And I would try and go out in a boat, and when the person who's going to take me in a boat would find out that I'm an author, he wouldn't take me because he would get a $40,000 fine for doing so. And what I figured out in writing the book was that as the number of oiled species was increasing, the photographs were decreasing because we couldn't tell the story anymore. What we did start seeing increasingly were the staged photos at the bird cleaning facilities. And those were happening, and those were great, but it was about 0.1%, because the other thing that happens with species that are oiled is they don't make their way to shore, really hard to make sure that you find them. They fall into the ocean and they sink to the bottom of the ocean and they die. And what people have learned from Valdez and from this is that I'm going to get the statistic wrong, I have it in the book, but it's something like 1/10. You know that the number is about 1/10 of the actual species that die are what you see, especially in a body of water as big as the Gulf Coast. So a lot of what was happening was people who cared a lot and sacrificed a lot of their time and passion to make sure that they could save as many species as they could. Another part of it was a propaganda piece, was to get people to take those pictures and see those images. And the other problem is that in the accounting, BP has made it very difficult to get the information. I've met a lot of people who quit the natural resource damages assessment process, which was trying to actually figure out how many animals were killed and beaches were harmed, at a protest against BP because they couldn't get the information that they wanted to. They couldn't count the information correctly. And that's one of the problems has been with counting birds, because they're financially responsible for every dead animal, but it also sends a message about the extent of the disaster. I'm going to try and answer it more briefly.
What are your thoughts about the role of the Coast Guard in the initial days after the disaster? It appeared that they were doing public relations for BP, and well of a cover-up. In fact, they made a statement initially that there wasn't, within the first hour, there was no oil being spilled. That was number one. And then by the end of the day, they were estimating 5,000 gallons a day in total was being spilled. And obviously we knew it was more than 100 times that. So the bottom line is, why did the Coast Guard continue to operate in this sort of cover-up role for BP instead of actually being the policemen that they're supposed to be?
Okay, I go through this whole story at great length in the book, and it's hard to respond to it quickly. I can do it slowly. I can take all night. So the question is about the Coast Guard and the relationship of the Coast Guard to the disaster. So there's two pieces to that. The first is members of the Coast Guard did amazing work in response to this disaster, from the time of the explosion through trying to recover oil, through trying to protect beaches. The Coast Guard was everywhere, and they were fabulous. One of the first pieces of this story that's important to know is the fire, because the whole thing actually starts with the fire. BP and Transocean and the oil companies were supposed to be ready for a fire on a rig. The Coast Guard isn't supposed to be ready for that. They're there for search and rescue. Nobody was ready for a fire on this rig. Nobody had planned for it. Nobody was ready. Nobody deployed. There were 9 good Samaritans who were in the area. They responded to Andrea's distress call. They put water onto the rig, and it's quite possible that water led the rig to capsize. Now, had the rig not capsized, there might not have been a gusher, and that's a long story which I go into in the book.
That is science news, that the rudder pipe was above the surface of the ocean, and these idiots kept on flooding the rig, and it sunk, and it said you're never supposed to sink the ship. And I thought that was part of a cover-up.
No, I mean, and they weren't idiots. These were people who showed up in response to a distress call. Right.
I think the rig. There was something fishy about that.
The problem was that there was nobody in charge. That was the problem. These were good Samaritans who showed up and saw a fire and did what they thought they were supposed to do, and there was nobody in charge to say, this isn't what we should be doing. When the rig capsized, it released the gusher. Now, that was the first stage where there was a problem. So there's just sort of two pieces very quickly to the Coast Guard response. In the very beginning of the story, the Coast Guard was telling the truth. And the very first interview, the spokespeople for the Coast Guard said, we have an oil spill. We have an oil spill from this rig. We're estimating it to be about 13,000 barrels, which is what they thought at the beginning, which is what they actually thought. And that's what they said. Within 24 hours, the media circle was circled. And the story changed radically. And the Coast Guard got brought into a story which unfolded throughout the course of this event, which was an attempt to lessen the knowledge about how much oil was leaking and the extent of the disaster. And that was a BP-Obama administration partnership in deception. And it continues to be today, unfortunately. And it's not the Coast Guard per se, it was the administration that was calling the shots. So, I don't like, I definitely pick on members of the Coast Guard within the book, but the Coast Guard as a whole was mostly filled with people who were doing amazing work. It was Mary Leandri and then Thad Allen, but they were, I don't know how to do this answer short. So, they were working with the Obama administration, which basically the sort of story of the administration's response was the more President Obama was out front on this disaster, the lower his poll numbers fell. So he couldn't win. He'd go out on the beaches, he'd be out there, he'd be all over the place, and his poll numbers would plummet. And President Obama had a lot on his plate. Healthcare, he had 2 wars, an economic crisis, and the decision was we need to get this thing off the radar because we just can't win. And that was the decision that the administration made. It was this, really stark political calculus. It isn't to say that they didn't do things to try and deal with the spill, but that was how they dealt with the policy, which meant that there was no policy. I'm going to take one more question. Yeah, Beth. Say it again.
Are there any guarantees this kind of catastrophe won't occur in the future?
No. Yeah, no. I mean, there's two important parts of what went wrong here. The industry is desperate for oil, and they've used up I'm loath to use the word easy stuff, but the easier stuff. And deep water is a place where there is a lot of oil. And they are going after it because we're letting them go after it, and they're racing each other for it. But it doesn't mean they know how to do it. And they don't, in fact. And we don't have a federal government that has the ability to say no. A story that kept coming to my mind was, I cover in The Tyranny of Oil, the Enron story. And the Enron energy traders say, they're caught on tape saying, when they were manipulating the price of electricity, we were kids in a playground and there was no supervision. We knew what we were doing was illegal. We knew it was immoral, but nobody was watching, so we did it anyway. And that is, to me, exactly what it feels like is happening with this drilling. They know they can't do it. They know there are huge ramifications for failure, but nobody is supervising them, and they're supposed to be going to make money, and that's what they need to go do. And that's what they're doing. And it's for us to say, yes, we need oil. I am the first one who will say, we cannot just say tomorrow, no more oil. But while we are dependent on these companies for this resource, we have to be the parents. And we have to say there's places you can't go. There's things you can't do. If you have to fight a war for it, if you have to kill someone for it, if you have to go somewhere where the consequences of failure are so extreme, You just can't do it. And we'll figure out how to deal with the consequences, which is that we have to make other policy changes. And that's, we need to be the adults. And, that's your takeaway message from the book. So thank you all very much for coming. Please sign the sign-in sheet.
You've been listening to policy analyst, author, and activist Antonia Juhasz talking about her latest book, Black Tide: The Devastating Impact of the Gulf Oil Spill. To find out more about Antonia Juhasz and her book, please visit her website at black-tide.org. You can also find her at Facebook at Black Tide Book. This program was produced by PDX Justice Media Productions in cooperation with Flying Focus Video Collective of Portland, Oregon. To find out more about PDX Justice and to access our growing library of free on-demand streaming video and audio programs, please visit our website at pdxjustice.org and write to us with your comments and questions at pdxjustice@riseup.net. You can also find our channel on YouTube and the Vimeo Home for Videos. Just search on PDX Justice. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots democratic community media.
To public policy. And working on corporations, it didn't take very long to have my focus shift really almost very quickly and almost exclusively to the oil industry. Beginning in the year 2000 with the Bush administration was really the period of the rise of, I'm going to move over here, the rise of the wealth of the oil industry to proportions where it really hadn't been in a significant period of time. All right, we're going to get happy with this at some point. All right, good. And really just started catapulting during the 8 years of the Bush administration. And that was for a number of reasons, which we can talk about later, but basically the rise of the wealth of the industry to historic modern heights occurred over the 8 years of the Bush administration. And of course, we're down a little bit in 2009, but today we have new. I have been working on oil and oil issues for a very long time. My background includes working for 2 United States members of Congress, and it was actually working for Congress and trying to work on domestic social policy that I kept running into the role and influence of corporations, making it more difficult to do the work that we wanted to do, and left Capitol Hill to basically focus on that impediment. So you've got the ocean, and then 400 feet below that is where the drilling starts, typically, that or shallower. In the last 20 years or so, the industry has really, in a significant way, moved into the deeper water. And it used to be that actually the definition of deep water was a 400-foot well, 400 feet below the ocean surface. Now the definition of a deep water well is 5,000 feet below the ocean surface. So you take the rig, you then go down 5,000 feet to the ocean floor. This well is another 13,500 feet below that. So it's 18,500 feet below the ocean surface. And that's not even close to the deepest. Actually, for a while, the deepest was another BP well called the Tiber well out in the Gulf of Mexico. It was 40,000 feet down. So it was as far down as Mount Everest is up. And that's still not the deepest well. But this is fairly new production, fairly new operations. But the industry guaranteed us that as the new oil company profit reports just out, and they are back, if anyone was worried, The oil industry's profits are back to where they were in 2008, absolute record-breaking highs, and they now remain the wealthiest industry on the planet, so we can all feel rest assured that they're doing great. And when the Deepwater Horizon exploded on April 20th, 2010, 50 miles off the coast of Louisiana, I was contacted right away by people asking me to write about it, and I started writing about it. But a couple weeks afterwards, I went down to Houston for actually Chevron's annual shareholder meeting, where I was gathered with a number of people from Chevron-affected communities where Chevron operates around the world, who had gathered for Chevron's shareholder meeting. We were there, and then a number of the people who were part of our network were from the Gulf Coast, and they brought us down to the Gulf Coast afterwards to see for ourselves what was happening. And I realized on that first trip, which was at that point several weeks after the explosion had taken place, that this wasn't your average explosion and your average problem. Because anyone who knows about offshore oil, unfortunately, knows that deaths happen fairly regularly. Explosions happen, spills happen. Of course, the loss of 11 lives was unique and extreme. The loss of a rig was unique and extreme. But what became clear after several weeks, which we didn't know preceding the explosion, was that the oil industry actually had no idea how to deal with a deepwater blowout. And to explain what deepwater is very quickly, the vast majority of offshore drilling always has and still does take place at about 400 feet below the ocean surface.